One evening, as the rain poured outside, Kemi found Adissa sitting in the living room, sketching quietly. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you think they believe us?" she asked softly. Adissa looked up, his expression conflicted. "I don't know, but we need to be more careful." Kemi hesitated before leaning closer. "What if we don't have to hide anymore? They don't care about us. Adissa, they never have. Why should we live by their rules?" Adissa shook his head, torn between his feelings for his sister and the nagging guilt that plagued him. "It's wrong, Kemi. Even if they don't care, we know it's wrong." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise, a door creaking open upstairs. Panic flashed in their eyes as they quickly separated, their hearts pounding. They waited, holding their breaths, but no one came downstairs. After a few minutes, they exhaled in relief. Little did they know it wasn't paranoia. It was Mr. McCarthy, who had quietly returned home earlier than planned. The rain battered the windows of the McCarthy mansion as night settled in. Inside, the twins believed they were alone. Mr. McCarthy had been away on yet another business trip, and Mrs. McCarthy had called to say she'd be attending a late dinner with a potential investor. The house felt as hollow as ever, a space filled with luxury but devoid of warmth. Unbeknownst to the twins, Mr. McCarthy had returned unexpectedly from his trip. His meeting in Abuja had concluded earlier than planned, and he decided to surprise his family. He had hoped to be greeted by laughter or, at the very least, his children asking about his trip. Instead, he found the mansion disturbingly quiet when he arrived. Something about the silence felt different tonight. His instincts prickled as he ascended the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. Passing by the study room, he noticed the door slightly ajar and paused. It was empty, but a faint trail of perfume lingered in the air, leading him to suspect the twins had been there. As he moved toward their bedrooms, his brows furrowed. The door to Adissa's room was closed, which struck him as odd. Adissa usually left it open, especially when Kemi was in her own room. Placing his hand on the doorknob, he hesitated. A muffled sound came from within, a low murmur that froze him in place. He pushed the door open silently, his heart thundering in his chest. The scene before him stole the breath from his lungs. Adissa and Kemi were on the bed, entangled in a moment that shattered every boundary of familial decency. Once upon a time, in the gated community of Adebayo Heights, the McCarthy mansion stood as a monument to success. Its gleaming glass walls reflected the rising sun every morning, and its manicured gardens were the envy of neighbors. Inside, however, the grandeur masked an unspoken void. Mr. McCarthy, a towering figure with sharp features and a commanding presence, spent most of his days closing high-stakes deals. His wife, the glamorous Mrs. McCarthy, was equally busy, managing her booming fashion empire. Their kids, Adissa and Kemi, lived in a world of affluence but isolation. At 15, Adissa was a reserved boy with a knack for sketching. His notebooks, filled with intricate drawings, were his escape from the deafening silence of the mansion. Kemi, on the other hand, was vivacious and inquisitive, though her bubbly exterior often masked her insecurities. Despite their differences, the twins were inseparable, bound by the shared experience of neglect. Every morning, the McCarthy parents left early for work, their departure signaled by the growl of luxury cars rolling out of the driveway. They often returned late, their absence stretching into weeks during business trips. In their stead, Jonas, a wiry, middle-aged man with kind eyes, became the closest thing the twins had to a caregiver. Though Jonas was a security guard, he played many roles: a watchful protector, a surrogate father, and a silent witness to the growing tension within the family. He often found the twins huddled together in the garden or whispering in corners of the house, their laughter tinged with something he couldn't quite place. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonas noticed Adissa and Kemi sitting unusually close on the garden swing. Their conversation was inaudible, but their body language spoke volumes. A chill ran down his spine as he struggled to dismiss the unsettling thought forming in his mind. Jonas's unease grew over the following weeks. While Adissa and Kemi's bond had always been close, it began to shift in ways he found unsettling. They often disappeared for hours, retreating to the far end of the garden or locking themselves in their shared study room. When they reappeared, their cheeks were flushed, and they avoided eye contact with him. The mansion itself felt eerily quiet in their parents' absence. One fateful evening, Jonas, doing his rounds, heard muffled voices from the upstairs window. It was past 11 p.m., and the house was unusually quiet. Concerned, he moved closer, and what he saw left him stunned. Through the partially open curtains, he glimpsed the siblings in an embrace that crossed the boundaries of brotherly love. He found Adissa and Kemi, the two siblings, making love to each other in bed. Jonas's heart sank. He knew what he had seen was wrong. The question was, what should he do? After much deliberation, he decided to inform the McCarthys. The parents, he thought, needed to know the gravity of their neglect. When Jonas shared his discovery, the reaction was immediate. Mr. McCarthy was furious. "Impossible!" he barked, pacing the room. "My children would never behave like this. You're accusing them without proof." Mrs. McCarthy gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. Mr. McCarthy narrowed his eyes, his face a mask of disbelief. "Are you accusing my children of something improper?" he demanded. Jonas stammered, "No, sir. I only wish for their well-being." The twins were called into the living room. Adissa and Kemi, standing side by side, exchanged nervous glances. Mr. McCarthy's booming voice filled the room. "Your mother and I have been told something disturbing. Is there any truth to it?" "What are you talking about?" Kemi replied, feigning innocence. Adissa crossed his arms defensively. "We heard that you two—" Mrs. McCarthy hesitated, unable to finish the sentence. "That you've been inappropriate with each other." The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Kemi's eyes welled up with tears. "How could you even think that?" she cried. Adissa followed suit, his voice steady but full of hurt. "We're siblings. We love each other, but not in the way you're suggesting." The parents exchanged uneasy glances. Without proof, they had no choice but to believe their children's denials. However, their trust in Jonas had been shaken. That evening, Mr. McCarthy summoned the guard to his office and delivered the verdict. "You've served us well over the years," he said coldly, "but I cannot overlook baseless accusations against my family. Your employment here is terminated. You are fired, Jonas." Jonas accepted his dismissal with dignity but left the mansion with a heavy heart. His warning had gone unheeded, and he feared for what might come next. With Jonas gone, the twins felt emboldened. The fear of being caught faded, replaced by the thrill of secrecy. They grew reckless, meeting late at night in the study room and even leaving subtle traces of their time together. A misplaced sweater, a lingering scent of perfume. One evening, as the rain poured outside, Kemi found Adissa sitting in the living room, sketching quietly. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you think they believe us?" she asked softly. Adissa looked up, his expression conflicted. "I don't know, but we need to be more careful." Kemi hesitated before leaning closer. "What if we don't have to hide anymore? They don't care about us. Adissa, they never have. Why should we live by their rules?" Adissa shook his head, torn between his feelings for his sister and the nagging guilt that plagued him. "It's wrong, Kemi. Even if they don't care, we know it's wrong." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise, a door creaking open upstairs. Panic flashed in their eyes as they quickly separated, their hearts pounding. They waited, holding their breaths, but no one came downstairs. After a few minutes, they exhaled in relief. Little did they know it wasn't paranoia. It was Mr. McCarthy, who had quietly returned home earlier than planned. The rain battered the windows of the McCarthy mansion as night settled in. Inside, the twins believed they were alone. Mr. McCarthy had been away on yet another business trip, and Mrs. McCarthy had called to say she'd be attending a late dinner with a potential investor. The house felt as hollow as ever, a space filled with luxury but devoid of warmth. Unbeknownst to the twins, Mr. McCarthy had returned unexpectedly from his trip. His meeting in Abuja had concluded earlier than planned, and he decided to surprise his family. He had hoped to be greeted by laughter or, at the very least, his children asking about his trip. Instead, he found the mansion disturbingly quiet when he arrived. Something about the silence felt different tonight. His instincts prickled as he ascended the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. Passing by the study room, he noticed the door slightly ajar and paused. It was empty, but a faint trail of perfume lingered in the air, leading him to suspect the twins had been there. As he moved toward their bedrooms, his brows furrowed. The door to Adissa's room was closed, which struck him as odd. Adissa usually left it open, especially when Kemi was in her own room. Placing his hand on the doorknob, he hesitated. A muffled sound came from within, a low murmur that froze him in place. He pushed the door open silently, his heart thundering in his chest. The scene before him stole the breath from his lungs. Adissa and Kemi were on the bed, entangled in a moment that shattered every boundary of familial decency. Their faces twisted in shock as they realized they were no longer alone. Kemi let out a gasp, pulling the blanket up to cover herself, while Adissa scrambled to sit upright, his face pale. Mr. McCarthy stood frozen, his towering figure casting a shadow that seemed to fill the room. His eyes darted between his children, disbelief and fury warring on his face. What is this? His voice was low, trembling with barely contained rage. "Dad," Adissa began, but his father's booming voice cut him off. "Don't you dare speak." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of the rain hammering against the windows. Mr. McCarthy stepped closer, his expression one of utter devastation. How could you betray everything we've taught you, everything we've sacrificed for you?" Kemi's voice trembled as she tried to explain. "Dad, please, you don't understand." "Don't I?" he snapped, his eyes blazing. "I understand that my children, my own flesh and blood, have brought shame to this family." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Mr. McCarthy's anger was palpable, but beneath it lay a deep sense of failure. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, a pillar of the community. Now, standing in his son's bedroom, he felt the weight of his neglect crashing down on him. "Do you even realize what you've done?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "This isn't just a mistake, it's a disgrace. What kind of people are you becoming?" Adissa's face crumpled as he finally spoke. "We're not bad people, Dad. We're just alone." The words hit Mr. McCarthy like a punch to the gut. Alone. The very thing he had tried to avoid by providing his children with everything they could ever need: luxury, comfort, and security. But he had failed to give them the one thing they truly needed: his presence. "You don't get to use loneliness as an excuse for this," he said, though his tone softened slightly. "You think you're the only ones who feel abandoned? Do you think your mother and I wanted to spend all our time working? We did this for you." "For us?" Kemi shot back, her voice rising. "You think a big house and fancy clothes make up for never being here? You've been absent our whole lives, Dad. You don't know us. You don't even try." Her words hung in the air, raw and cutting. Mr. McCarthy took a step back, as if physically struck by the truth. At that moment, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the standoff. Mrs. McCarthy entered the house, shaking off her umbrella as she called out, "I'm home! Is anyone awake?" Hearing no response, she climbed the stairs and was met by the sight of her husband standing in Adissa's room, his face a mask of despair. She looked past him and saw the twins, their expressions a mix of guilt and defiance. Her smile faded instantly. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice uneasy. "Ask them," Mr. McCarthy said bitterly, gesturing toward the bed. "Ask them what they've been doing behind our backs." It took her a moment to piece together the scene before her. When realization dawned, she staggered backward, her hand clutching the doorframe for support. No, this can't be true." "It is," Mr. McCarthy said grimly. Our children have lost their way." Tears streamed down Mrs. McCarthy's face as she sank onto the edge of the bed. "How did this happen? Where did we go so wrong?" Kemi's voice broke through the silence. "You were never here. That's where you went wrong." The night descended into chaos. Accusations flew, voices were raised, and tears were shed. The twins confessed to their feelings of abandonment, while the parents grappled with the consequences of their neglect. "We thought we were doing the right thing," Mrs. McCarthy sobbed. "We thought we were giving you the best life possible." "You gave us everything except yourselves," Adissa said quietly. By the time the argument subsided, the family was left in shambles. The parents realized that their pursuit of success had blinded them to their children's emotional needs, but the damage had already been done. The days following the confrontation were marked by a heavy, suffocating silence in the McCarthy household. The once lively corridors now echoed with tension, guilt, and regret. Adissa and Kemi spent most of their time in their respective rooms, avoiding their parents and each other. Mr. and Mrs. McCarthy, too, were at a loss. For years, they had operated under the assumption that financial success equated to good parenting. Now, faced with the painful reality of their children's actions, they were forced to confront their own failures. One evening, Mr. McCarthy broke the silence. Sitting across from his wife in the dimly lit living room, he sighed deeply. "We can't leave things like this," he said. "We need help." Mrs. McCarthy nodded, her face pale and drawn. "But what kind of help? How do you even begin to fix something like this?" The next day, the McCarthys reached out to a family therapist recommended by a close friend. Dr. Chakotay, a compassionate woman in her 50s, arrived at the mansion the following week. Her calm demeanor and non-judgmental approach put the family at ease, even as she began to delve into their darkest truths. During the first session, Dr. Chakotay listened intently as Adissa and Kemi described their feelings of abandonment. Kemi, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion, said, "It's like we were invisible. They were always gone, and when they were home, it was like we didn't exist." Adissa added, "We didn't know how to cope, so we turned to each other. It was wrong, but it felt like the only thing we had." The parents, overcome with guilt, admitted their own shortcomings. "We thought we were doing everything for their future," Mrs. McCarthy said, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't realize we were neglecting their present." Dr. Chakotay guided the family toward understanding. "This isn't just about what happened," she said gently. "It's about rebuilding trust, creating boundaries, and learning how to connect as a family." The healing process was slow and arduous. Therapy became a weekly ritual, forcing the McCarthys to confront their pain and work through their emotions together. One exercise involved writing letters to each other. Adissa and Kemi poured their hearts onto paper, expressing the deep loneliness and confusion that had driven them to their actions. Their parents, in turn, wrote letters of apology, acknowledging their failures and pledging to be more present in their children's lives. Outside of therapy, the family made changes to their daily routine. Mr. McCarthy cut back on his business trips, while Mrs. McCarthy delegated more responsibilities to her staff, freeing up time to spend at home. Even simple activities like having dinner together became opportunities to reconnect. For the twins, the journey was particularly challenging. They began attending individual counseling sessions to address their feelings and learn how to form healthy, independent identities. Amid their efforts to rebuild, the McCarthys realized they owed someone else an apology. Jonas, who had been unjustly fired, had tried to warn them out of genuine concern for their family. One afternoon, Mr. McCarthy visited Jonas's modest home in a nearby neighborhood. The old guard opened the door with a wary expression, but his face softened as Mr. McCarthy extended a hand. "Jonas," he began, his voice filled with remorse, "I came to apologize. I should have listened to you. You were right, and I was wrong to dismiss you." Jonas studied him for a moment before nodding. "It wasn't an easy thing to speak about, sir, but I cared for those children. I still do." The two men spoke at length, and by the end of the conversation, Jonas agreed to return to the McCarthy household. His presence brought a sense of stability and familiarity, particularly for the twins, who had always seen him as a protective figure. Months turned into a year, and while the scars of the past remained, the McCarthys began to see the fruits of their efforts. The twins developed new hobbies and friendships, learning to rely on themselves rather than each other for emotional fulfillment. Kemi joined a local drama club, where she discovered a passion for acting, while Adissa began taking art classes, finding joy in expressing himself through his sketches. Their relationship, while still close, became healthier and more balanced. For Mr. and Mrs. McCarthy, the experience was a wake-up call. They learned to prioritize their family, understanding that success meant nothing without the love and trust of their children. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, laughter filled the air, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Jonas watched from his usual spot near the door, a faint smile playing on his lips. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. The McCarthys were no longer the fractured family they had once been. They were stronger, more united, and determined to never repeat the mistakes of the past. The story of the McCarthy family serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of neglect. While material wealth can provide comfort, it cannot replace the emotional connection and guidance that children need from their parents. In the end, the family's willingness to confront their pain and seek help allowed them to rebuild their lives. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like this. God richly bless you. Catch you in the next video.